The Zora Neale Hurston Trust presents the It's All About Zora series. We'll be discussing all things Zora with artists, academics, and fans of Zora Neale Hurston on the It's All About Zora series. Plus, we will uncover her influences on our guests' lives and work. So let's get the conversation started.
Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I am so ready to dive in and speak with you about Zora Neale Hurston, whose life and legacy intersects with your life and your journey in so many different ways. And so I just want to start by asking you, when were you first introduced to Zora Neale Hurston? Was it a book or was it in class? Did you discover her on your own? Talk to me about that.
I think it was in school, and we read Their Eyes Were Watching God. I certainly don't think it was in high school, probably college. Professor Dennison at Brown, she had this Black women writers class. And I think that was one of the books that we studied was Their Eyes Were Watching God. There's your life pre-Zora and there's your life after Zora, and I think we can say that about Alice Walker, we can say it about Toni Morrison. Like you are forever changed after you experience their writing, you experience these worlds that they present on the page. The book was became this sort of totem that I carry with me. I think that's the measure of Miss Hurston. She is transformational in that way.
After reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, did you seek out other Hurston writings?
I didn't seek out any, and I was so stunned by it. It's sort of like how I, when I discover new music, there's that one song that I like, and I stay on that one song and I play it for hours and hours at a time. And then I'll go back to it, maybe even a year later and start looking at other cuts from it. And I'm like, that was on that album, So I think, Their Eyes Were Watching God was on repeat for a long time.
Is there a particular line or moment in that book that stands out to you?
No, it really is just the idea of being a free woman, how that articulated in who you loved and how you loved, and that was a new idea for me, particularly being from the South in this sort of very regimented cultural world. There was only one way to be, there was only one way to love. This was what you were supposed to be. And if you veered off that in any sort of way, that it wasn't just cultural shame, but it was hell. You were going to hell.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was damnation. It wasn't just, community condemnation. It was hellfire, eternal hellfire. And so I don't know how conscious I was that this was what I was reading, that I was reading a woman who was self-determined, but in the process of doing that and giving herself the right, not just the permission, but the right to do that. I think that's what hit me so much. I was this country kid and did not know what that looked like. I saw it in my mother, but what I also saw in my mother was so much shame was attached to my mother's decisions because she was doing things that just absolutely confounded everybody in my family.
Right.
And then I'm like reading about, Janie, and I'm like, okay, here's another woman that's living the life she wants to live.
We've talked about you growing up in Macomb, Mississippi, talked about being raised by your grandmother and how your mother lived in San Francisco and all of that. And so, something you just said really struck me. I wonder at this point in your life right now, what does it mean to be a free woman to you?
I have a certainty about what I am. Like I have an essential core, I haven't had to arrive at it. I've been that for a minute. But at the same time, I am still a Black woman from Mississippi whose roots, whose foundation is centered and informed and designed by the Baptist church experience, the Southern Baptist church experience. It is the opposite of oftentimes a liberated life. What I found myself in this moment in my life of being caught in between, not because of an uncertainty, but because of love, because of the care I have for that community, for the care that I have for that culture. I'm not somebody who hates the Black church, because you have that reaction as well. Mm-hmm. And who hates the community that the Black church has fostered and designed, which has made people feel small, erased them, has in fact been violent against them. They've had to hide. But I'm somebody who's like, even in the face of that, I still love it, because what I know is that my Southern Black experience, my Southern Black church experience, has made me what I am. It's made me the writer that I am. If I ever got anything right on screen, it informed that. It made me a woman who believes that whatever I have, if it's not in service of somebody else, then it does not matter. Mm-hmm. Those things were taught to me by that experience, mm-hmm. by that experience. Yeah. And I know that. I'm clear. I know that the way that I feel most connected to who I am as a Black woman, as a Black person, when I feel most free, actually, is when I'm in the Black church experience. Mm. So there's a lot of conflict there. There's a lot of tension there. So where I am right now is having that core, having that centrality of, I am what I am. I am a queer Black woman. I reject misogyny in the Black church, and I want to actively fight those things, At the same time, how do I do that and make the people around me still feel loved and protected?
So much to unpack there. So let's just start with Zora Neale Hurston's legacy. We know that Hurston was a queer Black woman, pioneer in the Harlem Renaissance, yet she was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. And Alice Walker is largely credited with, reintroducing her work to the masses, so to speak. And I think about what you just said about, the ways in which, not just in the Black church, but then how that translates to Black cultural movements of Black women kind of being written out of them and being left out and being forgotten. And so I want to, let's go down that road and talk about that. One of the things that stands out so much to me about a lot of your roles as an actor is that it's almost like you two are going back and like putting the headstones, so to speak, on the unmarked graves of those women who we don't know, who we don't see. What does it mean to you to be going back and like getting these stories of Black women who history would have forgotten about and written out had you not pushed for their stories?
Well, first of all, I think that imagery that you just, it's stunning, putting the headstones. I just think that's brilliant, and I'm going to use that. So
it is yours to use.
Listen, you might see yourself quoting, honey. I'm just letting you know. I played the matriarch of the Clark sisters family, Mattie Moss Clark, one of the most central figures in American music. The white folks will never see her that way. She is. And so I definitely felt that Alice Walker correction of putting a headstone there. You also have these women who are very much alive. In the case of Venus and Serena's mother, you have this woman who is very much alive and actively being written out of the story of her daughter's lives, because the salesman of that story, the one doing the pitch, was her husband. He has the loudest voice. He is a dude. So that's who's going to be listened to. All of the work that she did, she was this wonderful mother, of course, but she was their coach. She designed their play, particularly Serena's play. And it matters because, you know, you see the player that Venus is, and you see the player that Serena is. Of the two of them, she was the coach that had the most influence on Serena's play, but nobody knows that. If King Richard is successful, one of its successes is that correction. We gave Miss Orsina her propers.
I just find all these, like, again, parallels between you and Zora, because one of the thing that she did was going and recording, you know, just kind of everyday folks and getting their story all throughout the South and throughout the Caribbean. And you know, I know that you had the opportunity to narrate the audiobook of an unpublished book of short stories of hers, hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick. And I'm curious, you know, how did that opportunity come about? What made you say yes?
That was the hardest thing I've ever done. Those audiobooks, listen, they are no joke. A shout out to the audiobook actors. Girl, listen, I walked out of there mad every day. I'm like, this is not good for people. Could you just in a room by yourself with a microphone, mispronouncing words left and right?
Her language is like,
Yes.
it's complex. Like, it's not, you
Yes.
know, conversational
Yes.
like conversation is for us
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah. It is another kind of language, and we can't sleep on that. How she speaks and writes that dialect, it is another kind of a language, and you have to respect it as such. You know, and because, you know, I walked in there taking for granted that, oh, I'm from the South, I can just say this. No, it's not like that. It was not like that at all. It was humbling. It was hard. It was very, very hard. And at the same time, it was incredibly rewarding. Through the process of that, I got to love her writing in another kind of way. I loved her writing because of their eyes, but appreciated on another kind of level. Miss Hurston's writing operates in so many different ways that are so textured, and it can be written off because of the way that it's written. Having to read it and then speak it, and then sometimes read it again, then I'm seeing on all these different levels where she's operating on that are visceral, that are intellectual, but they kind of creep up on you because of how she writes.
Do you have a favorite story from that book?
John Redding goes to sea.
Okay, that was one of her earlier works. Yes.
That was, oh my God. When I think about it, I just the way that mother loved John, and just wanted to hold him and keep him and not let him go. Starting with the first line, the villager said that John Redding was a queer child. That's the first thing that she says about him. Now, of course, in 2022, it evokes so much for us, what that word queer means. But then she goes on and describing what that word queer means is like how he imagined the world and how he wanted to see the sea. I mean, the metaphors are crazy, right? It's so rich. And getting to the end, it says, out on the bosom of the river, bobbing up and down as if waving goodbye, because he was drowning.
Right.
Piloting his little craft on the shining river road, John Redding floated away toward Jacksonville, the sea, the wide world at last. Girl, it brings tears to my eyes. It's so tender and heartbreaking at the same time, because it meant him dying, but it also meant him being free.
Yes.
But he was going to die the way he wanted to live, you know? He wanted to be free, and the sea was his idea of freedom. Anyway, I could go on forever, but John Redding is my favorite.
Well, and that's something that we see a lot in her work, is we see like storms as means of like destruction and renewal. And we also see this kind of recurring theme, and you've talked about it, you know, in our conversation today, of like how unusual it is to be uneasily satisfied. Whether we talk about Janie in Their Eyes Are Watching God, or whether we're talking about John Redding Goes to the Sea. When she was talking about him being queer, she was talking about him being like different from the rest of his community in that he wanted more. And I know because you and I have had conversations in the past about being artistic, creative Southerners and what that means to kind of dream outside the box of being a teacher or a nurse or a secretary. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but
Oh
like,
my God, no.
to go be artist. It seems so impractical to people because it's like unprecedented, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I wonder, like, are there any other spaces and places in Hurston's work where you see parts of your own life, parts of your own story?
Hurston had, an obsession with Black ritual, how she tells a story, the same story, but a couple of different ways.
Mhm.
How we worship, how we tell stories to ourselves, how we dance. And all of those things are essential for her as a writer explorer of the culture. And I share that with Black culture, particularly. We always return to ourselves. We'll reference outside of it, certainly, but we are always self-returning in hip hop, particularly now, that we are always in conversation with each other, with our past, but we're always returning to each other to go forward as Black folks who create. And that's so interesting to me. And Zora was one of the pioneers of that.
The late Valerie Boyd was a mutual friend of ours. She's how we became connected. And she wrote a biography of Zora Neale Hurston, Wrapped in Rainbows. And I know at one point you all connected because there was a desire to turn Wrapped in Rainbows into a film or a series or something like that. And I'm curious, would you still like to see that project come to fruition?
I would. It has to. It has to. I refuse to use that verb was. We will always pull from the well and the wealth of Valerie Boyd. She is, and she will always be and is. And her book, Wrapped in Rainbows, is one of the most brilliant things I've ever read.
You have other projects you're working on about women who are very much in the footsteps of Zora Neale Hurston. You're working on a screenplay about Fannie Lou Hamer, as well as some other projects. So talk to me about those.
I would have loved to have heard a conversation with Fannie and Miss Hurston. They are, two women who are essentially Black Southern women that defines and orders so much about who they are and how they moved around in the world, their work, both written and oral. They are these women who reflect and are always returning that thing that we talked about earlier, the snake that, eats its own tail. Yeah, and that's what I think about, the brilliance of Black culture. And those women walk in that tradition. They find their glory within the community around them. As opposed to looking somewhere else to find it. So yeah, we are working very hard on that. I'm closer than I was the last time I talked to you.
Okay. One of the places where Mrs. Hamer and Ms. Hurston definitely intersect is like the deep and genuine concern for poor people, specifically poor Black people, and like standing in that and saying, your economic status is not an indication of whether you matter or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we're wrapping up, I want to ask you, as we've been having this conversation, it's been so rich, but I do want to ask you, what do you believe that younger generations, future generations can glean from Hurston's work?
How modern her writing is, that what separates her from a lot of other very brilliant writers, we're going to read Zora 100 years from now and still feel what we felt. That there are still lessons to learn from Janie. We will read a story where the first sentence of the villagers said that John Redding was a queer child, and know what that means on the many levels that Zora meant it, even though queer didn't necessarily mean colloquially what it means now, but it is an othering that she was tapped into and is celebrating as opposed to running from it and hiding from it. It's a modern idea, modernist writing. Generations to come will always be able to read it and it will always feel fresh. I was listening to Joe Morgan, and you listen to him, you listen to someone like Miles Davis, and that music will never be dated.
Yeah.
It will never be dated. It will always sound like somebody just got up this morning and wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's the mark of brilliance. You can listen to some music and it can be dope. It's not that it's bad, you know what I mean? It doesn't mean it doesn't bring you joy,
Mm-hmm.
but you know that it is of a time.
Yes.
It will always have that feeling of invention.
Mm-hmm.
That's what courses through Zora's work, you know, in invention and writing, self-invention, and how that plays into her as a woman, as a Black woman. It'll never grow old.
Like a godmother of literary invention.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Well, before we end, I just have to ask if there's anything else you want to share, anything else you want to say.
No, I just want to tell the Hurston estate, thank you for wanting to include me, and I hope that, you know, the work that I do will always be, you know, honoring Miss Hurston's legacy.